Alright, so Cyrene was released recently, and if you haven't been keeping an eye on the community over the past month or so, it has been a pretty wild time. I think it's pretty safe to say that Cyrene is one of the most doom-posted characters the game has had in quite a while, though it's not necessarily without reason. She has definitely got some weird quirks in her kit, and also her design in general, and I think it's worth talking about not just for the sake of discussing how weird this specific situation is with Cyrene, but also the state of how the game releases its characters in general. Really, in my opinion, Cyrene is pretty emblematic of how the game has changed over the course of its lifespan, from one that used to be extremely flexible to one that's now pretty much going entirely in the opposite direction. But Cyrene's place in the meta isn't entirely defining the state of the game on its own, but it is giving some hints about how characters might fit into the meta in general. So today, I'd like to discuss not only what Cyrene is currently doing in the game, but also how she might be a tell for how things will be going forward into the future. But first, I've got a quick note from today's sponsor. Topping up in gacha games can get pretty expensive, and if you happen to be looking for a way to bring those prices down, then lootbar.gg is definitely worth checking out. Lootbar is a trusted top-up site where you can make in-game purchases for multiple titles with up to a 25% discount, and it delivers your order within seconds after payment. For example, if you're someone who wants to marry Cyrene, they've got a character guarantee bundle that you can purchase just to get her. All you've got to do is enter your UID and select your server for instant delivery, and I'm sure your new anime wife will thank you for that purchase. If you just want to top up in general, you can also check out their other popular bundles, like the limited 6,480 crystal pack or the all-in-one bundle, both of which have really nice discounts too. Lootbar is super easy to use, safe, and secure. It supports multiple payment methods, has 24/7 live customer support, and is trusted by tons of creators and players around the world with a 4.9 out of 5 rating on Trustpilot. So if you're interested in getting the best bang for your buck rolling for your next anime girlfriend, you can click my link down in the description below or in the pinned comment to get started. New users will get a 10% discount code, and even if you're a returning user, you'll still get an 8% discount code automatically. Thanks again to Lootbar for sponsoring this video, and now let's get back to it. As I was saying before that segment, let's talk about Cyrene. For those of you unfamiliar, Cyrene's whole kit is designed around being a support for a specific set of characters. Basically, if you've got any of the characters from Amphoria's, she'll be a decent teammate for them, but if you want to run her in a team that doesn't include those characters, her value definitely drops off because her buffing capabilities aren't as strong for them. That's not to say she can't be played in other teams, but I mean, there's definitely a lot of options other than her. For example, if you run Cypher with Cyrene, her damage will be increased and she lowers the defense of the enemy lineup. On the other hand, if you run, say, Jingli with Cyrene, the only thing that she gives her is a 40% damage boost. Obviously, yeah, there are some other parts of her kit, like Cyrene does give true damage to the team, but both Amphoria's and non-Amphoria's characters can benefit from that, so to be clear, I'm specifically talking about the targetable buffs that Cyrene offers. I do have to say, on paper, her being specific to certain teams isn't necessarily a bad thing. Like, if you have 10 different teams and Unit A is only usable on 5 and Unit B is usable on the other 5, then at least personally, I feel that there's enough variety there for it to be okay. But obviously, that doesn't account for the fact that not everyone has the specific characters to make 5 different teams for each unit, and also, I mean, hey, it's a gacha game. What if people just lose their 50-50s?
Wow!
And that's not even mentioning that not every character is equal in terms of the value they can gain from someone like Cyrene. Like, let's take a look at my account for example. Before the last patch where I got both Evernight and Anoxa, I only had 4 out of the 10 released heirs, 2 of which were supports and 1 of which was a sustained. Someone like me, or someone that lost their 50-50s like I mentioned just a bit ago, could very easily be in a spot where rolling for a character like Cyrene just doesn't have a lot of value for their account. I mean, let's be real here, what do you think is more impactful between the 200 crit damage and free nuke that Cyrene gives my day, or the 30 crit damage that Saridra gets? It's a pretty obvious choice, and also as a result leaves Cyrene in a really weird spot for those aforementioned players. Also, I do think it's worth mentioning here that Cyrene is a unique character like Akron and Fei Zhao where she doesn't have a regular ultimate. Instead of gaining energy, she gains points when her allies take actions, and after gaining a certain amount of points, she gets to use her ultimate. Coincidentally, the characters that charge this the quickest are the different Amphoria's characters, and what this does is pretty much give you an even higher incentive to play into how specific Cyrene is due to this mechanic. But with that said, I will say that being specific isn't really a new thing per se. Like, think of a character like Black Swan. Apart from Dot Team, she really doesn't have that much value overall. Another example would be someone like Fugue. Outside of Break Team, she basically doesn't have a place in the game. But I do think this brings up a pretty important point. Both of those characters I just mentioned are specific to teams rather than specific to characters. If you don't get the difference, let me explain. There's basically different levels of how specific you can be when designing a character. You can think of it kind of like a spectrum, where on one end you've got hyper-specific units that literally only work with one unit, and then on the other hand you've got extremely flexible units that can be played with everyone. For most of HSR's lifespan, I would say they were actually pretty close to the middle of that spectrum, or even leaning towards that flexible side. I mean, starting off with the game's launch, you could pretty much run whatever you want, wherever you wanted, and I think it was only in 2.x with both the break and follow-up metas that it started to shift more towards the other side. And even though the shift started in those metas, there were still a lot of options you could use within them. Like instead of using Firefly, you could use Himiko. Instead of Boot Hill, you could use Luca. Instead of Topaz, you could use Hunt March. I mean, hell, I even ran Break Fei Zhao for a bit just because it was a funny team comp. The important part wasn't really just the DPS you could use though, it was actually more the supports that allowed all those DPS to be played. Or in short, the supports were flexible enough that they could be played in a wide and diverse pool of teams, both limited and not, and some of them even add value outside of their respective teams, like Gallagher being used post-break meta, and Ron Mei being a generic support that's usable in a large variety of different teams. Right, like those support units like HMC or Fugue or Robin work with the different team comps that are currently in the game because their respective metas were designed around them rather than around who they were supporting. As a result, anytime a future unit for those teams are released, they'll be the go-to characters for them. The next break unit will probably still work with Fugue. The next follow-up unit will probably still work with Robin. And on top of that, they have the flexibility to also be considered for teams outside of just break or follow-up. Or, in other words, assuming they don't eventually get fully power crept, they have longevity because they are the de facto units for those teams and the building blocks that they're built off of. But on the other hand, if we go back to that spectrum I was talking about earlier, Cyrene's quote-unquote teams are so much closer to the side that's super specific because she's not locked to a damage type like break or follow-up. She's locked to the characters instead, and we're never going to get more of them. The second that Maide or Finon or Inoxa fall off, well, Cyrene probably will too. And I mean, sure, that probably won't happen for a while, but it definitely will happen eventually. Honestly, most likely after we see the usual end-of-patch power spike as we go into 4.x. Really, I think that's the main thing to be concerned about with Cyrene. She's an end-of-patch character, or I guess an end-of-planet character since we do have one more releasing in 3.8. Something that I've personally said ever since we first saw her kit and how specific it is that she's kind of a character that was designed with the idea of extending the length of the Chrysos heir's meta relevance. And this isn't the first time we've seen something like this, like think of Fugue and Sunday. Without Sunday, the hypercarry meta would have been pretty much dead in 3.x. Without Fugue to take the place of the HMC, the break meta would have been dead too, and honestly, even with her, it's still struggling without higher investment into the team. At least in my eyes, Cyrene is that same type of character. If you want your Maide to be good in 4.x, I am positive that she'll keep him viable enough through that just like Sunday and Fugue did in the previous metas for the previous characters. But, at least personally, I'm not entirely sure I like this kind of character release though. Like, honestly, whether it was the older characters back in 2.x or Cyrene now, being an end-of-patch character is almost like a curse, because it pretty much guarantees that the character releasing is meant for one specific thing. On the other hand, I feel like most of the characters released in earlier patches of a cycle are a lot more flexible overall. Like, think about it, Inoxa who released back in 3.2, one of the most flexible units in the entire game. Hyacine in 3.3, probably one of the most broken units in the entire patch cycle that's playable literally everywhere. I mean, hell, even the Kolab characters are pretty generic units that you can use basically wherever you want. But pretty much every end-of-patch character has been the opposite. They're locked to something specific, whether that be a team or a group of characters, and personally, I don't really know if that's a great thing overall. I think the really concerning thing with these types of characters though is that just because they enable their respective units to last longer overall, that doesn't necessarily mean that they don't still have a finite end like I mentioned earlier, and that's even more of the case for a character like Cyrene. Like if you're someone that has Maide as your only Chrysos heir, the second he goes out of the meta, then say goodbye to your Cyrene too. And honestly, that's really just because her non-heir buffs don't really make her a good enough substitute for someone like the RMC to last outside of any team that doesn't have an heir. Like 40% damage and some true damage is nice, but it definitely won't take you all that far in the grand scheme of things. One other thing that's kinda unfortunate about these end-of-patch characters is that they're not really all that usable for someone that isn't a long-term player. Like, imagine starting the game right now as a new player. If you see Cyrene's design and are like, yeah, I really want to get that character, who are you going to use her with? I mean, sure, in the current patch there's a ton of different heirs running, but getting Cyrene pretty much would force that new player into only rolling for heirs in the future, as that's basically all she really is useful for. It's almost like a way of locking your account to a specific subset of characters, and that's not necessarily unique to Cyrene, to be clear. With Fugue, for example, even though every unit in the game can use her and turn into a Super Break DPS, at the end of the day it does kinda lock you into rolling for Super Break adjacent characters like ones that buff your break efficiency or healers that work really well with them or whatever else. And personally, I've always been someone who advocates for variety in gameplay, and I really don't feel like these end of patch characters lean into that all that well. Something I feel is even more disappointing though is that in Cyrene's case specifically, the age-old solution of vertically investing doesn't actually work here to solve her problems for non-Chrysosaur units, all because of how specific her buffs are. If you don't know, getting E2 Cyrene starts her with more of the points that she needs to use her ultimate, but just because she can get the ult quicker doesn't really change how mediocre her buffs are for anyone that isn't an Amphoria's character. And like, isn't that kinda crazy? You know, like even if you swipe and go all the way to E2,
What are you?
the main purpose of her targetable skill is to buff the very specific characters that she is intended to be played with. I really do feel like if you were to invest that much into a character, then they should be able to gain some flexibility, almost like how a character like Acheron gets more versatility with her E2. But with Cyrene, that just isn't a thing, at all. And at least personally, I found that kind of frustrating due to the fact that it almost feels like Hoyo is deciding how the character can be played, rather than the player doing it for themselves. Like, there's not really a workaround for it, and honestly, whether you're someone that's really focused on gameplay or someone that might just like the character, I have to say it doesn't really feel that great. This is something that I've talked about before quite a bit, but I feel like it's worth mentioning every time a situation like this arises. Slowly over time, not only have we lost flexibility when putting our teams together, but now even how you play the character themselves is starting to be taken out of the player's hands. You know what? Maybe that's a good thing though. For a game that used to be leaning towards that flexible side of the spectrum, I do have to say that it really is disappointing. At the end of the day, whether you decide to vertically invest or not, right now she kind of feels like a character that will end up just delaying the inevitable. And I mean, I guess that's fine. Like, if you can get a year's worth of gameplay out of your Amphoria's characters by getting her, then obviously that's a good thing. But with that said, I do think she would have been a lot more interesting of a character if she pulled up some of the other non-Amphoria's characters too. Being completely honest, it does kind of frustrate me that this is the route that they decided to go for with her. I mean, don't get me wrong, she is absolutely a playable character that I'm sure most people can get some value out of, but I do think she definitely leans more towards the too specific side of the spectrum, and for a beloved character like Cyrene, I feel it would have been really nice if we could play her in a variety of different team comps. Apart from that, I do have to say that I'm not really a huge fan of the fact that you kind of want to push to E2 to make her more playable, and I also have to say that I'm absolutely not a fan of the fact that they're selling a $300 bow skin just for her, with no top-up bonus to go with it. They could have made it at least a little bit more affordable if they were going to do something like this, and it definitely makes me a little bit concerned that future characters that also work in the same way like Cyrene will have this same problem. Really, like I mentioned at the beginning of this video, Cyrene is kinda emblematic of the state of HSR. She is an extremely restrictive character that wants high vertical investment and has very specific needs to function, which is something that we've seen become more and more common as the 3.x patch cycle has progressed, and that's why I'm concerned for the future of the game as well. I mean, it's not even just the characters, because the game modes like Anomaly Arbitration are also super specific too. With that said, personally the way I've started to look at this whole situation is to kinda just label Cyrene as a waifu character in my head. Sure, she can give value to most accounts, and if you've got a bunch of Chrysos heirs, then she'll give you even more value, and honestly, at this point that's fine. Is it ideal? Obviously no, it's not. But I really do feel like at this point in the game's lifespan, we should just be treating HSR like a game that you should be playing with the mindset of strictly having fun and chasing after the characters you like. Because at the end of the day, it's up to Hoyo how they want to monetize and promote their characters, and whether we like it or not, characters can be released just like Cyrene, and honestly, probably will be released just like her in the future. There are plenty of versions coming in the future, and as we go into 4.x, I think that a character like Cyrene essentially putting a bow on the Amphoria's arc isn't the worst thing in the world, but I do think the entire situation could have definitely been better than it is. Anyway, that's all my thoughts, and I appreciate you listening if you made it this far. If you have some thoughts of your own on this topic, I'd love to hear about it, so feel free to leave a comment down below or join my Discord link down in the description to talk with me about it. As usual, thank you so much for watching, subscribe, and if you haven't already, maybe give my other videos a shot too.